Space, the final frontier.
Welcome to Daily Variety, your daily dose of news and analysis for entertainment industry insiders. It's Wednesday, March 25th, 2026. I'm your host, Cynthia Littleton. I am co-editor-in-chief of Variety alongside Ramin Satuda. I'm in LA, he's in New York, and Variety has reporters around the world covering the business of entertainment. In today's episode, we're talking Star Trek with Variety's Joe Otterson. He analyzes the outlook for the Star Trek universe on television. That was, of course, the theme of the original NBC series that you heard in the cold open. Otterson broke the news this week that the latest Star Trek series to run on Paramount Plus, Starfleet Academy, will end after just 2 seasons. It's not a good sign for what was once one of TV's most durable franchises. Otterson helps put it into perspective for us. But before we get to that, here are a few headlines just in this morning that you need to know. The big story that everybody's talking about in showbiz is the demise of Sora. OpenAI decided to pull the plug on its generative AI-powered video service. Disney is dropping its plan to invest $1 billion in OpenAI now that Sora won't license its characters. And everybody is trying to figure out what went wrong. We'll unpack this more in Thursday's episode of Daily Variety with business editor Todd Spangler and chief legal writer Gene Mattis. The BBC has a new Director General. Former senior Google executive Matt Britton will take the helm of the UK pubcaster on May 18th. He replaces Tim Davie, the Euro TV veteran who was forced out of the post last November amid a scandal over the editing of Donald Trump's January 6, 2021 speech for an episode of the BBC documentary series Panorama. Holy Gollum! Stephen Colbert and his son, screenwriter Peter McGee, have been tapped to write a new Lord of the Rings movie for Warner Brothers and producer Peter Jackson. Colbert is a long-established Tolkien superfan. He had a cameo in the 2012 rendition of The Hobbit that was directed by Jackson. Venice Film Festival chief Alberto Barbara is set for a cameo in Season 2 of The Studio. Seth Rogen's Apple TV comedy has been on the Lido in recent weeks, Lensing. My colleague Nick Vivarelli in Rome had the scoop. Joe Scarborough and Micah Brzezinski are sticking with MS Now. The Morning Joe hosts have signed a new deal that keep them with the all-news cabler through 2029. All of these stories and so much more can be found on Variety.com right now. And now it's time for conversations with Variety journalists about news and trends in show business. Joe Otterson, Variety's TV news editor, broke the news that Starfleet Academy will shutter after its upcoming second season. There's no way to shade it. The Star Trek franchise is in a wobbly place. The shields are weak. Joe and I have both been Trekkers, dedicated to Gene Roddenberry's optimistic vision of the future since we were kids, and it shows in this conversation. Joe Otterson, thanks for joining me today.
Always a pleasure.
You broke a big story that landed very big in the universe of Star Trek fandom. Starfleet Academy, the company's hope for a next generation Star Trek franchise and universe of characters. The curtain is going to fall on this show after 2 seasons. This is not a success for the studio or for the platform, and it really seems indicative of a franchise that does seem to be a little bit adrift. It is floating in space. Joe, tell us what's going on with Starfleet Academy and tell us what's going on in the bigger picture for Star Trek.
Paramount was very hopeful for Starfleet Academy because, on average, Star Trek fans tend to be older, and this was a really big attempt by them to start bringing in a younger audience to get them more involved in the franchise. Unfortunately, it did not connect with audiences. It didn't get the kind of viewership they needed to justify continuing it. They had already renewed it for a second season before the first season aired, so that season just finished shooting within the past few weeks, and then they made the decision to say, well, you know what, we're going to air this season because we've already shot it, but ultimately this just isn't a good fit for us anymore, so unfortunately it is going to be ending. In terms of the larger franchise, this definitely doesn't portend well for the future of Star Trek on TV in the Alex Kurtzman era. Alex Kurtzman's been shepherding the Star Trek franchise for about a decade. So there is still this last season of Star Trek Starfleet Academy to come out. There's 2 more seasons of Strange New Worlds to come out, which I think is also a great Star Trek show. But just beyond that, there's been rumors of other things, like other kind of spin-offs of these shows that they would attempt to do, but it just seems like this is going to be the end of this current iteration of Star Trek on TV. They haven't had the kind of success with it I think they wanted. It's a very, very valuable piece of IP for Paramount, but just ultimately they have not had the success they needed to have to justify putting the kind of money they've put into these shows, because these aren't cheap. These are very visual effects heavy productions. It takes a long time for post on shows like this. So what is going to happen beyond this final season of Starfleet Academy and these last 2 seasons of Strange New Worlds is anybody's guess, but it just very much seems like the Alex Kurtzman era of Star Trek is coming to a close.
Truly, Star Trek is the OG show that proves that nothing ever dies in television. It is just dormant, waiting for somebody to come along to reboot it. You broke this news. You do say that Kurtzman will remain with CBS, which still produces a whole lot of dramas, procedural dramas, genre dramas.
According to well-placed sources, yes, he is currently in talks to either sign a new deal, extend his deal, which runs out at the end of 2026. Whether or not, though, that deal will have him remaining at the helm of Star Trek very much remains to be seen. Again, he's had success in television and films, beyond Star Trek, so it's certainly not outside the realm of possibility that he would stay on with CBS Studios, continue to develop other shows there, produce things, but just given the track record for Star Trek at this point, I think that it would be a good time, like maybe let this one live for a little bit, and then definitely I think Paramount wants to ramp up their ambitions for Star Trek on the film side. There has not been a Star Trek film since I believe it was Star Trek Beyond more than a decade ago. They have other movies and ideas in development. There was talk of Quentin Tarantino developing a Star Trek movie at one time, which would certainly be a choice. But it just, again, the original Star Trek and the Next Generation started out on TV, and then they were able to then move that cast into a very successful film series, both for the original series and for Next Generation. And that's just not something you've seen with any Star Trek shows since then. None of these shows have broken out in a way where you could successfully transition one of these series casts to a film project.
Let me ask you, does it say something about our times, the world we live in, that the Star Trek vision of a diverse ensemble, teamwork-driven future toward something that looks like democracy with the Federation and all of that mythos that you and I both know? I mean, that feels very sad to me to even think about, but genuinely, what do you think?
Yeah, there's certainly something to that, because one thing that they really dove deeply into in a lot of these new shows was, outside of that utopian ideal of you saw in the early series, the idea of the Federation as this great government and everything, and this
A United Nations-like body.
But I think there's probably something to that, just where people's minds are at now. But at the same time, one of the things that I really enjoyed about Starfleet Academy was it did really harken back to that sense of optimism. Like, I remember watching the pilot for Starfleet Academy and being really impressed, because not only did they really harken back to the sense of optimism you felt when watching the original series or Next Generation, but then they literally posed the question to the students at this first class to come back to Starfleet Academy in a long time. They're showing them this wall with all these names of great Starfleet heroes, like Captain Kirk, like Spock, Picard, etc. And they pose that question, like, which of you will be the next person on this wall? Which of you will be that person who steps up and leads us into the future? And that's something that I think that Star Trek, unfortunately, has kind of failed to answer in these past 10 years. There hasn't been that one thing that's broken out to the point where you could say this is the future of the franchise.
Do you think any of this has to do with the larger changes at Paramount and CBS in the last year? Obviously, Skydance came in and now they're busy buying another studio. Like, there's a lot going on there.
Yes and no. I've seen a lot of discussion about that. People saying, oh, with this new regime coming in, they didn't want woke political Star Trek to come in. And I love when people talk about the idea of oh, Star Trek is woke now. It's like, so you never watched Star Trek at all. But I think ultimately the impact that the Ellison regime would have had is they took a very hard look at what was working, what wasn't working, and just unfortunately a lot of the stuff hasn't worked, and it's not cheap to make. Paramount never touted the viewership or anything like that for the show.
Well, to take the temperature, of course, I went to Reddit. So I was curious about how your story landed. I took one look at it and affirmed that it was picked up by everybody, so kudos. Now, granted, Reddit is a little bit like talk radio, where you're going to have more angry people calling than happy people. But let's just say there is concern expressed about there's been a lot of seemingly fairly forgettable shows. But yeah, on the Reddits, I think the vote there is that it is time to hand the tricorder to somebody else in terms of television. In terms of movies, I know that this is true because I read it in Variety. So the latest that Variety has reported back in November by our dear colleague Brent Lang is that screenwriting duo Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daley, who wrote Dungeons & Dragons, Honor Among Thieves, and Spider-Man Homecoming, are working on a new film that will be utterly unconnected to anything else previous in the Star Trek universe, film or TV. Does that sound like a good approach to you?
Yeah, I think so, because I think you're seeing, not that you should look to copy what everyone else is doing, but I think you've seen great success with that lately, where people are taking these very big, epic, well-established franchises, and instead of continuing down that path, you're telling kind of smaller, more personal stories, kind of scaled back the big crazy set pieces, and really focus in on characters and just tight back storytelling. People love that stuff right now. I mean, you can look at things like Night of the Seven Kingdoms, I think, is a great example of that. The Mandalorian is not a small show by any means, but I'm just saying in the sense that it's not necessarily about the Skywalkers or Han Solo or Princess Leia. It's about a completely separate character that exists within this universe, but it's something completely different we haven't seen before, and people really enjoy stuff like that now. So if you can do it in a way that, the bones still feel like Star Trek, like it still has kind of like some sort of a Star Trek core to it, but you're telling different stories with different characters, I think that's really important, because you can't just keep rehashing the same thing over and over again. Like, how many more times can we see a different actor play Captain Kirk or something like that? You know what I mean? You have to mix things up a little bit from time to time.
Joe Otterson, thank you so much for reporting so thoroughly on this world. I love seeing your great work and Variety picked up everywhere.
Thank you, and as always, live long and prosper.
As we close out today's episode, here's a few things we're watching for. Don't miss my colleague Chris Willman's coverage of NCIS's astounding 500th episode milestone. There were a lot of surprises and some big changes for the squad on last night's episode. Willman has all the details on a show that he has covered for decades. Tip of the hat to CBS and Team JAG. Wonder Project and Amazon Prime Video will unveil Season 2 of House of David on March 27th, just in time for Passover, Good Friday, and Easter. My colleagues Elsa Kaslasi and Elise Schaefer are getting ready to wrap their coverage of the Series Mania TV Festival in Lille, France this weekend. The fest has produced a number of headlines already about new shows and buzzy talent, so keep watch on Variety.com this weekend for the latest. We love to hear from our listeners, so please send thoughts, gripes, and other feedback about Daily Variety to podcasts@variety.com. Before we go, congrats to Adam Cunningham. He's been promoted to Global CEO of Allied Global Marketing. He's been with the company since 2011. Cunningham had been Chief Strategy Officer of Allied Global since 2020. Thanks for listening. This episode was written and reported by me, Cynthia Littleton, with contributions from Joe Otterson. Stick, snicks, hick, picks. Please leave us a review at the podcast platform of your choice, and please tune in tomorrow for another episode of Daily Variety. Star Trek The Paper Chase. We'll send them all to law school, intergalactic law school.
Space lawyers.